freedom of self-consciousness, when it appeared as a conscious manifestation in the history of spirit, has, as we know, been called Stoicism. Its principle is that consciousness is a being that thinks, and that consciousness holds something to be essentially important or true and good only insofar as it thinks it to be such. In this very short paragraph 198, Hegel is going to identify, he's going to give a name for this new shape of consciousness that has emerged in 197, but was already there, starting to emerge in the end of the master-slave dialectic in paragraph 196. He's going to say it's called Stoicism. And this is very interesting for a variety of reasons that we're going to see in this paragraph and other paragraphs yet to come. One is that, this is a time in the phenomenology where we can say, aha, here's what Hegel's actually referring to determinately. Stoicism is a philosophical school, one of the very important philosophical schools of ancient culture, ancient Greek and Roman culture, and it emerges in what's called the Hellenistic age. That is, this time in which the Greek city-states are, to a certain degree, losing their identity, their freedom, their importance as communities, and becoming part of larger social matrices. What we're going to see happening around this time is the conquest by the Macedonians of Greece and then of a whole bunch of other areas, including Persia, the ancient enemy of Greece, Egypt, uniting things into one, economy was the word that was used, and oikonomike, this vast household, which then would break up into successor states, which would war against each other, try to carry out the same sort of dynamics of power, but no longer on the basis of what we might call, city-state ethnic identities, in which an individual would be part of and would be rooted in that community. Same thing is happening, by the way, on the other side of the Mediterranean, as two great arch rivals, Rome and Carthage, are themselves, empires that are fighting against each other and against the Greeks and against, soon to come, semi-Greek state in Epirus. There's all sorts of fascinating history happening here. What's really important as far as the movement that is Stoicism, a philosophical movement, what's important here from a Hegelian perspective is that a new shape of consciousness has emerged as self-conscious, as on the scene in the form of a philosophy, in the form of some sort of body of doctrine, not quite the same thing as a religion. We're going to see that religion plays an incredibly important role in the later paragraphs of this section of self-consciousness. But in terms of a way of life, not only a way of thinking, and we're going to see there's a lot of talk here about thought, but thought as part of an entire attitude of life. So Hegel says Stoicism is the conscious manifestation of the freedom of self-consciousness in history. It's not the only one, but it is an early manifestation of that, and it's one that is going to recur over and over again. There are going to be revivals of Stoicism as time goes on. We're going to see Stoicism historically, not in terms of Hegel's project so much, but historically, become very important within the Roman Empire and all of its sort of tributaries, culturally, economically. Then it's going to end up becoming more or less absorbed into Christianity. If you look at the practices of the ascetic monks out in the desert, and you know something about Stoicism because you've studied your Epictetus or you've studied your Seneca, you're going to see quite a bit of commonalities between them. on some very important points about how you should conduct yourself, how you should use your mind, how you should cultivate your will. And we're going to see Stoicism arise out of its ashes again in the Renaissance, where people self-identified as Stoics. We're going to see today that there are modern Stoics, who there's quite a few of them, so I don't need to single them out by name, but who view this attitude, this form of life, this form of consciousness, this shape, this gestalt, as something not only particularly useful for them to get through the day, but as revelatory of truth, revelatory of reality. So Hegel is really according Stoicism what might seem to be a very high compliment in saying, all right, this is what happens next. On the other hand, it's not quite so much of a compliment as we're going to see in the next 3 paragraphs, because Stoicism, for Hegel at least, it's an important development, but it turns out to be kind of a dead end. It doesn't live up to its promises, and this can be dialectically revealed, and then the Stoic will quit being a Stoic. In any case, there's a importance here of historical development. Stoicism only shows up on the scene as Stoicism, not as certain elements of Stoicism, like being a tough guy warrior or things like that, but as a full-fledged philosophy when the world, when human history is ready for it. So there has to be this passing through the master-slave dialectic before Stoicism can actually become a going concern. Now, he's going to tell us a little bit about what's central to Stoicism here in these passages that I put up on the board and parsed out a little bit for you. He says that Stoicism has the following point of view, let's call it. And there's 2 main points. One leads directly into the other. Consciousness is a being that thinks. And, when I say that, if you've ever read your Descartes, that, immediately is going to remind you of Descartes and meditation too. What am I? I'm a being that thinks. What is it to think? That's where it gets very interesting. Because to think doesn't just mean to be totally isolated from things, but it does mean that there is the connection to the subject. So there's this shift to subjectivity. Thinking can take on many different modes. We're going to see that's the case. Descartes, by the way, is in some respects a neo-Stoic. So now he goes on and he says, what does this really mean? This means that something has essential importance, or in the German, Wesenheit. We're going to see this word Wesen show up again down below here. So it's a little bit important to pay attention to these interconnections. Something has essential importance, or you can say essentiality, or you can say is an essence. There's different ways of framing this, but you understand what we're talking about. Something has a centrality to it. Something has a kind of legitimate demand upon our attention as being important. When, or only, insofar as consciousness thinks it to be such, is how Miller translates it. Now the German is a little bit different than that. Here the emphasis tends to be on what is happening to the thing that has essential importance. It's being thought, right? And Hegel actually says only insofar, and then here's the German, sich darin denkendes Wesen verhält. This has to do more with the being that's doing the thinking, the self-consciousness, or if you like, consciousness, right? Consciousness, in its relationship, in its comportment to the thing, treats itself or acts as a thinking essence, a thinking being. And so there's 2 things going on here. Consciousness is thinking the thing, and we've seen this already with sense certainty and perception and forcing the understanding that to perceive, to intuit, to mark out, to understand something, it implies a relationship with a thing that always seems to be receding from our grasp. That's what we call the vanishing moment. There's something eluding us in the thing. Stoicism is going to, you might say, hug the thing tight in thought. It's going to say, this is what it is. It has essentiality only insofar as it is an object of thought for me, the thinking thing. That's essential. Now notice what else he says here. Something has essential importance, or is true, or is good. Truth and goodness, epistemological and moral qualities, or you might say bases, because that's really what epistemology and moral theory, moral philosophy is oriented by. How do we get to the true? How do we assure ourselves that what we think is true is true? How do we know that what we think is actually good is good? This is talking about what the Stoics are going to call the criterion that we're going to see Hegel talk about a little bit more in future paragraphs. So keep all of this in mind as we now plow through Hegel's treatment of Stoicism. The manifold, self-differentiating expanse of life with all its detail and complexity is the object on which desire and work operate. This manifold activity has now contracted into the simple positing of differences in the pure movement of thinking. Essential importance no longer attaches to the difference as a specific thing, or as consciousness of a specific natural existence, as a feeling, or as a desire in its object, whether this is posited by myself or by an alien consciousness. What alone has importance is the difference posited by thought, or the difference which from the very first is not distinct from myself. This consciousness accordingly has a negative attitude towards the lord and bondsman relationship. As lord, it does not have its truth in the bondsman, nor as bondsman is its truth in the Lord's will and in his service. On the contrary, whether on the throne or in chains, in the utter dependence of its individual existence, its aim is to be free and to maintain that lifeless indifference which steadfastly withdraws from the bustle of existence, alike from being active as passive into the simple essentiality of thought. Self-will is the freedom which entrenches itself in some particularity and is still in bondage, while Stoicism is the freedom which always comes directly out of bondage and returns into the pure universality of thought. As a universal form of the world spirit, Stoicism could only appear on the scene in a time of universal fear and bondage, but also a time of universal culture, which it had raised itself to the level of thought. In paragraph 199, we're getting a much longer and, in many respects, richer discussion about what is actually taking place through Stoicism, through the comportment, through the way of relating oneself to the world and to oneself that is happening through Stoic philosophy. Not just through Stoic philosophy as something say contained in a book, but Stoic philosophy as lived, as a comportment towards the world. And as we're going to see, there is a kind of disengagement that's happening that Hegel is noting from the start. And Stoics would agree. They would say, yes, indeed, there are many things from which we think that we're too entangled and must withdraw ourselves in order that we can cure ourselves or at least carry out the therapy somewhat. Hegel sees this partly as an advance and partly as where Stoicism is going to founder. So let's look at how this comes about. You notice that I've got up on the board two sorts of ways that the Stoic can be oriented One has to do with the orientation towards life, and we've talked quite a bit about life, both in earlier sections, also in self-consciousness quite a bit. Life doesn't just mean one thing, but here in this context, the way in which Hegel is using life is to refer to the sort of manifold diversity of things going on that can be experienced, that can be engaged with. We might think of it as, the beings that are, and there are various ways of doing the things that they're involved with that we can't quite wrap our head around, and we can't have one single orientation towards unless we withdraw from it, unless we treat life as a kind of universal. Life, by its own nature, while being a universal, or as we saw earlier in self-consciousness, a kind of genus, a gatum, it also, by the fact that it differentiates itself into, it splits itself into, what he's calling great detail, great complexity, there is no one single thing that exemplifies life. It is in its profusion, we might say. So he talks about the manifold, self-differentiating expanse of life, right? Later he's going to call this the bustle of existence. Beautiful phrase used by the translator there. In all of its detail and complexity is an object for the human person. An object for the human person in what way? Well, at this point, it's not the naturalist out there, classifying all the different bugs in the Amazon or anything like that. It's the much more easy to relate to world that provokes our desire and that compels our work. And we relate to the world outside of ourselves, the world of life, the world of living things that are not just this living thing, through desire and through work, through many types of desire, through many kinds of work, and the two of these are intimately connected, as we saw. So he says, this is the object on which desire and work operate. And if we're not thinking about what we're doing, we end up having a kind of, what phenomenologists have called the natural attitude, where we just take things for granted. I've got to get to the bus stop. Why? Because I've got to catch the bus to get to my job. Why? Because I need to make some money. Why? Because then I can come, home, but hit the store on the way and get myself the pizza that I'm going to throw in the oven so that I can eat tonight and maybe watch some TV. Why? Well, because I've got to get up and work the next day, so I don't want to do anything too stressful. There's this whole set of whys that ultimately end up being kind of a cycle and unsatisfying as soon as we start asking the why. Or, which sometimes end up, amazing us as well, right? Those are all possibilities in life. And life is related to, by the Stoic, by every other human being, through desire and work. But that's not the only way that it can happen. So he goes on and he says this: manifold activity is now contracted into the simple positing of differences in the pure moment of thinking. So there's this, I've got this arc here of differences, when life is differentiating itself, as it constantly is, as it constantly has been. There's always like a prehistory of it that evades our grasp in the present. This complexity, this richness, gets reduced to a different way of understanding difference, which is abstract. Because it is difference on the part of thought. He says, essential importance no longer attaches to the difference as a specific thing. The essential importance doesn't lie on this side, as a specific thing, as a particular, right? Or as consciousness of a specific natural existence, or as a feeling that the person over here has towards these things, or as desire and its object or its goal. It's Zweck in German, right? Whether this is posited by myself or by an alien consciousness. That's where this is going to come in over here, the master-slave dialectic. But it doesn't necessarily have to be master or slave. We could also think in terms of how, we get to know what we should desire and what we should work on. It's not always through somebody domineering and, making us afraid and we have to totally change our lives. Oftentimes it's through seeing how everybody else in the world does things. Think about the way that recommendations work. We're all familiar with, because of online stuff, with Amazon recommendations, with Yelp. Now they actually are starting to produce, and they have it out there, social networks that are supposed to rate people. And not just rate people like Angie's List, for how they do their job, but rate people in general. What is going on with that? Is there a master telling you how to behave? No, you actually willingly take that information in, and you're like, I could use this. But what's happening there is some other alien consciousness is telling you about this world out there, that great world, and about parts of it. Now the Stoic withdraws from all of that. They withdraw from all of that by saying, I am going to emphasize this aspect of thought. That is what I really am. That is what is most me. All this other stuff isn't really me. It is me only to the extent that I have myself allowed those parts to sort of captivate me, to intrude into, to use a famous metaphor of the Stoics, the inner citadel. So the Stoic locates their own reality on this side, the side of thought, the side of consciousness. He says, what alone has importance is the difference posited by thought, or a difference which from the very first is not distinct from myself, because I am the one thinking all of this stuff out here, the parts that I allow to get in. I am the one who is in control of it. This is what was so liberating about Stoicism and remains liberating today, this sense that I don't have to just take my cues from what's out here or from some other self-consciousness telling me how it is. I get to think this out for myself. Now, of course, if I think it out in ways that aren't going to work, and I stick to those ways, I'm going to be profoundly unhappy. But I have the possibility of being free, of being happy, by resisting, all these sort of lures that are being put out there. So he says, this consciousness accordingly has a negative attitude towards the lord and bondsman relationship, towards the master-slave relationship. What does it do? In effect, it nullifies it. It leaves it in place empirically. It doesn't deny that there are power relations. It doesn't deny, for example, as Epictetus will tell us, somebody can come along and say, I'm going to put you in irons if you don't do what I say. He says, well, you can fetter my leg, but you can't actually fetter my moral purpose or will, however you want to translate pro and races. There's a whole conversation to be had about that. That's quite interesting. So nobody can really be a master and nobody can really be a slave except in a sort of arbitrary empirical sense from the perspective of Stoicism. He says, as Lord, it doesn't have its truth in the bondsman. If you're lucky enough to have been born a lord, like Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, all right, well, you act like a good lord then. You act like a good master. You run the empire and don't take advantage of everybody and try to make justice happen. And when you run into all the jerks out there that you prepared yourself for every single morning by saying, today I'm going to run into people like this and this and this and this. You steeled yourself against the world. You don't need anyone to be your slave. You're not getting your fulfillment through dominating somebody else and deriving something from their work, from their restrained desire. Likewise, he says, nor is a bondsman as its truth in the Lord's will and in his service. You may be a slave. Epictetus himself was a slave. And you do have to serve, if you don't want to get whipped or beaten or sold off or all these other terrible things that could happen to you. But the master doesn't control you. The master controls your body or how much food you eat or things like that. But they don't control you, what's really you, the essence of human being in you. He says, The bondsman doesn't have its truth in the Lord's will and service. On the contrary, whether on the throne or in chains, this is a beautiful formula here, in the utter dependence of its individual existence, its aim is to be free. And we see again this dialectic happening between the individual existence, the individual existing human being, and the universal. Freedom is, in a certain respect, something that has to always be made intensely particular, and yet it always evades any particular or specific formulation or example of it. You can't, bottle freedom up in that spot, right? Freedom is also a universal. It's a universal that's so universal that it cannot be an abstract universal. That's something that's lying behind Hegel's philosophy as a whole. So he goes on and he says, its aim is to be free and to maintain that lifeless indifference which steadfastly withdraws from the bustle of existence. I won't even cross this out, because what the Stoic does is not just nullify everything and say, you don't exist, screw you, because that would just be merely reactive. The Stoic withdraws. They don't have anything to do with the bustle of existence. They are in the middle of it, of course. Epictetus, for example, talks about, I woke up this morning and somebody came in, they broke into my place and they took some of my stuff. That's, being caught in the bustle of existence. And he says, but he had more need of it than I did, obviously, or at least he thought he did, so I'm not going to let it bother me. He took something made of brass, fine, I'll go get something made of clay, and now he won't steal it. It'll work just as well. That's a very Stoic attitude towards things. So he goes on and he says, alike from being active as passive into the simple essentiality of thought. That's what he's withdrawing into. The Stoic is pulling himself away from the world. This indifference. Now you're not going to see this in Hegel's text here. These are two Greek terms that get used quite often by the Stoics, also in their Latin forms. Libertas and apatheia, right? Or tranquilitas. And the indifference that he's talking about there really consists in these two sides. Apatheia is the not being disturbed by things, literally not suffering, right? Come from this word pathe, a feeling, a suffering, literally, something that somebody else or the world imposes upon you. This indifference allows the Stoic not to have to feel bad things when they happen. But it also requires the Stoic not to get too caught up in the good things when they happen too. This is a bit more, that's a sort of privative concept. This is a more positive concept. Eleutheria means freedom. It means the state of being a free person. And this can apply even to the slave who's a Stoic. The slave can be free insofar as they are a thinking being, and insofar as this other stuff out here doesn't really matter to them. And it's up to them. It's their choice whether this stuff matters to them or not. So he says, self-will is the freedom which entrenches itself in some particularity and is still in bondage. That's a different kind of freedom than eleutheria. The self-will locates itself out here somewhere, right? In some object, in some place outside of the self, which is vulnerable to this entire, mishmash of things that is life, which can be trapped in the master-slave dialectic as well. Self-will is that freedom. That's not the kind of freedom that you want. He says Stoicism is the freedom which comes out of bondage and returns into the pure universality of thought. Now here's where, we have to unpack a little bit. So if I'm a Stoic and you're a Stoic, my thought and your thought really have a lot in common. Because insofar as we're rational, I don't want to say we're the same person, but we have the same rational structure to our minds. Insofar as you become more rational, insofar as I become more rational, we become more like each other. We're more able to live in the kind of cosmopolitan, unity that the Stoics espoused as a social ideal. So here's what he says, here's how he brings this to a close. And this is quite important, going back to the historical matter. We've been talking about historical development. We haven't done an awful lot of that so far here in the text, now have we? But now we are going to do this more and more and more. We're going to say there's a determinate stage of history, of human development, that the dialectic needed to get to, and now it can go on to its next stuff after it exhausts that stage. He says, Stoicism could only appear on the scene in a time of universal fear and bondage, of slavery. Stoicism could only come on the scene at a time when anybody could potentially become a slave, where the sort of small commonwealths had been replaced by these larger and more, in some sense, abstract and in some sense more arbitrary imperial structures, where politics, a lot of people think that Stoicism is the result of the Greek city-state disappearing, and so Plato and Aristotle's views are just kind of old-fashioned. Stoicism comes on the scene for people who aren't political. But no, that's not really the truth about Stoicism if you read great Stoic thinkers. But it's a different sort of environment that they're in. One in which anybody could wind up becoming an emperor and anybody could end up becoming a slave. And as we see the history develop, that happens more and more often, right? There's a lot of ferment that's taking place. Also a time of universal fear. Anybody could become vulnerable to the things that are happening. This is a time in which a kind of globalization is occurring. And it's not just bringing, political transformations or economic catastrophes. It's also bringing in barbarian tribes swinging around and doing what they do, which usually isn't very good for civilized people, and diseases coming through, and great opportunities at the same time arising. There's, the ancient world, there's a lot going on in the time that Stoicism is happening. He says, this is a time of universal culture, Bildung. Remember that term Bildung that we saw so important in the preface. Bildung is what he's referring to here when he says it raised itself to the level of thought. The thought is taking place through Bildung, through images, through the things that form a culture. And when we look back, this is the last thing I'm going to say about this, when we look back on Hellenistic culture, what we're often tempted to think about are things like vases in museums and literary texts, plays that we could put on, costumes that people have. That's all very important. But what's more important is the people who produced it, the people who transmitted that culture, who built that culture, who argued against each other, who allowed that culture to have a framework. Culture is always human culture. So Stoicism plays an incredibly important role in the development, according to Hegel, of consciousness in the West.